Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I wanted to make a topical video tonight. There was something I saw online yesterday that brought a reoccurring question to my mind, and I wanted to discuss it here, share some of my thoughts, and maybe get some of your thoughts down in the comment section. The question is this: should we as Christians ever publicly or semi-publicly or maybe on social media give constructive criticisms about maybe the weaknesses, the things that we don't do particularly well in our specific churches, or maybe in the group of churches that we are associated with or have fellowship with? Should we ever talk about our weaknesses? Should we ever talk publicly, in a way that non-believers could hear about the things that we don't do particularly well, and maybe other denominations actually do better? So this question was brought to my mind again yesterday because I saw a post. It was a very constructive criticism of a group of churches and things that they don't do particularly well, things that are commanded in the scriptures that we just kind of have on the back burner and maybe don't do as well as we should. And inevitably, whenever I see a post like this on social media, there's someone down in the comment section who says, we shouldn't be talking negatively about the church because if a non-believer sees this, then they're going to have second thoughts about coming to our church. If we're just talking negatively about our weaknesses, that's not what we want them to hear. We want them to hear the positives and why they need to come to our church and why they need Christ. And that should be kind of our forward-facing, public-facing way of talking about the church as Christians. And then this discussion about what we don't do well, that should kind of be kept for private conversations. So that's kind of what I wanted to address. Is that true? Is it true that we should reserve our constructive critiques for private conversation and kind of shield the church from any bad publicity or any possibility of maybe someone outside, someone in the world, someone who isn't a member of our church? Should we shield them from any potential negative views that they might have of the people that go to a particular congregation? And at least in my thinking about this over a good period of time, my thought is no, we don't need to prioritize that, and we should have public or semi-public constructive conversations about the things that the church does really well and things that the church doesn't do so well. And I want to preface this by saying we need to have a balance, right? Don't be that person who only ever talks bad about their congregation, talks about, that fixated on all the things that they do poorly. No one wants, I've probably been that guy, I'm a little too negative. We don't want to be that person. We want to talk about the things the church does well. We want to praise it and promote it. But I think we can also be critical and constructively critical when the circumstances and the time calls for it. Another thing I want to mention here at the beginning is not only be balanced, but the kind of criticisms that I'm talking about in this video are constructive ones. I'm not talking about the guy who's just denigrating the church, talking it down, devaluing it. There are those people that just want to tear things down. But then there are people who give constructive criticisms of the church because they love the church and they want to call the church to be what Jesus wants it to be. And so they critique, but they do it out of love for the institution that we should all cherish and value. So those are the people that I'm talking about, and those are the kind of critiques that I'm talking about. One of the reasons that I think that we ought to have constructive conversations about the things that the church can do better in a private and a semi-public forum is because I actually believe that it's biblical. We actually see this in the way that God wrote and documented and preserved the scriptures. So, for example, 1 Corinthians. If you've ever read 1 Corinthians, you'll know that the book of 1 Corinthians does not shield the church from potentially from having their problems noticed by people in the world. Okay, so in the book of 1 Corinthians, if you're not familiar with it, there's all kinds of issues in the Corinthian church, and Paul has to write to the Corinthian church to fix these things. Like they're taking each other to court and suing each other. There's a man who is married or he is romantically involved with his stepmother. That needs to be corrected. There's issues that they're having with taking the Lord's Supper correctly. So they're worshiping incorrectly, and they're not respecting Jesus and his sacrifice. There are issues with idols and sacrifices that have been offered to idols, and confusion about whether an animal that's been sacrificed to an idol can be eaten or not, and whether that's allowed. And there's also kind of a sectarianism. There's they've broken off into factions based on who baptized them and what big name Christian they're associated with, right? So all of these issues at the beginning of the book of 1 Corinthians have to be addressed by the Apostle Paul. He writes about them, he corrects them very sternly in some cases, and he calls them what they are. He says, these are not good things. These are things that have come out of the corrupt minds of men that have infiltrated the church, and we need to purge the church of these things so that the church can be what Jesus wants it to be. Now, as Christians, pretty much all of us would affirm that it was God who decided which books were going to be canonized for the reading of the church, until the return of Jesus, and which letters weren't going to be canonized. We actually know that Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthians that we don't have record of. God decided not to preserve that one. He decided to preserve 1 Corinthians, even with all of its issues and its problems. And some people would say that Corinthians airs the church's dirty laundry. And there would be some people, if somebody wrote a public letter like that today, there would be people who would accuse that person of talking bad about the church in a public setting, in a letter that even non-believers could read, and they would really criticize a Christian and say, well, he should never have written that letter and let it get out into the public. It's like, well, I guess God could have had Paul write the letter in 1 Corinthians, and for that just to have been a private thing between Paul and the church at Corinth, and that not to get out to the wider world. He could have had Paul write another letter that he could have canonized that just talked about kind of the greatness of the church, the importance of the church in general, and God could have canonized that letter instead of 1 Corinthians. But that's not what he chose to do. He chose to canonize a letter that discusses internal, very, very unique problems within a particular congregation, and for that then to be available to anyone and everyone who ever even has the idea of becoming a Christian, and even to non-believers who read the scriptures. So it was perfectly okay in God's mind, it seems, for unbelievers to know that there are going to be problems that exist in local churches, and that those problems need to be dealt with, and there's an appropriate way to deal with those problems, and it's fine for people to know about those things, and for those things to be discussed. And so I think for me, that's one of the biggest reasons that I think it's okay to discuss problems about a church in a public setting, and that we don't need to be necessarily shy about that. We should be balanced about it, but we don't have to worry that we're going to scare other people away, non-believers away. And I think that this is actually the wisdom of God coming through, and why he allows a book like 1 Corinthians to be written and canonized for all to read. And that is because it shows us the church's stance on sin and what is going to be expected of those non-believers if they want to be part of God's church. Sin within the church is taken very seriously. It is not to be whitewashed or masked or a facade placed over it, just to make the exterior of the church look really good and shiny and like everything is perfect here within the walls of the church. No, that's not the way that we deal with sin. We deal with sin head on. We discuss it for what it is, even sins like, marrying your stepmother that have to be dealt with, gross immoralities. All that stuff's going to be brought to the forefront in the church, and we're going to deal with it because it's important that the church is holy and pure. The only way to do that is to call out sin when you see it. And this is also important and instructive for non-believers who want to become a part of the church, because it shows them the personal walk that they're going to have to walk through, that sin isn't acceptable here. right? People who want to be added to the church, they have a personal responsibility to die to sin, to get sin out of their life, because they're not going to bring that into the church. All of that needs to be dealt with both on a collective level and a personal level. So it shows people that if you're going to be added to the church, then you're going to have to make war on your sins, and that's a process of the church collective and the individual Christian. So I think the key takeaway is that there is biblical precedent to talk publicly about the things that a church needs to do better at. I think another thing to recognize that's important to understand this properly is that when somebody critiques sin or failings within the church, that is not a critique of the church as the institution that Christ founded. That is not a critique of the institution itself. It is a critique of the human weaknesses and human failings that flawed human beings are bringing into this perfect institution. Right? So people often say, well, if you talk about bad things that happen in the church or critiques of things we don't do well in the church, you're attacking the church. That's not true. You're not attacking the church that Jesus died for. You're attacking the missteps of the human beings who are part of that church. And again, that comes back to correcting sin where you see it and where it exists and getting that out so that the church can be what it's supposed to be. So constructive critique is not an attack on the church. It's an attack on sin and sometimes ungodliness and sometimes a lack of respect for the instructions that God has given for what his church is supposed to be. So we need to make sure that we understand exactly what those critiques are going after, not oversimplify it or try to accuse the one who is being critical of attacking the beauty of the institution of the body of Christ. I think one of the reasons that people often feel the need to put forward these public criticisms of a church or collection of churches is because our churches and our church assemblies are really not set up to have these kinds of discussions. And this has been, I guess, a constant frustration of mine and several people that I know, is that there really is not a forum, there's not an opportunity in the vast majority of churches to have these deeper discussions about maybe where we could be doing better and what are some of the things that are falling through the cracks. So, I mean, most churches are probably, set up in a similar way. It's like you meet on a Sunday morning, you have a schedule that you follow, a Bible class maybe in the morning, and somebody's teaching that, and they have their particular topic set out already, that they've already studied for, and that's the material that they're going to present. And then you go into maybe a period of worship, and you have your singing and the Lord's Supper and a sermon on a particular topic. And then, after the sermon, you have the closing prayer, and you all, shake hands in the lobby, and then you leave. It's pretty structured and scheduled, and it's all full. And there's not a lot of opportunity to have these deeper discussions about, maybe where the church could be doing a little better. For people who really love and cherish the church, this can be sometimes really frustrating, because maybe the teacher is teaching through the parables of Jesus for the fifth time in 5 years, or talking about going through the book of Acts for maybe the third or fourth time, discussing the same old things in Bible classes and in sermons, and never really getting to some of these things that are more pressing, the things that these people who love the church believe the church needs to be doing a better job at implementing. And so what do? Well, a lot of these people who have these concerns, they go to maybe the only outlet that they have to reach the church, and that is social media, where the people who they go to church with are all gathered throughout the week. And then sometimes when people post these things, people from their church, their fellowship, they get mad at them. They say, well, why are you being so critical of the church? Why are you having these conversations? These should be private conversations. It's like, well, the church really doesn't offer an opportunity to actually have these conversations in just a local church kind of setting. And so it is kind of all that I have. So maybe if this is a real issue for local churches, maybe think about changing up the structure of what we do on a Sunday or a Wednesday or a Sunday night, so that we can facilitate having some of these conversations. If it really is your priority not to have them publicly, I think a lot of people would be much less likely to post some of these online if they felt like they actually had a place to discuss these pressing matters in their local church. Because I think at the end of the day, it is our local churches that most of us really care about. I think, unfortunately, some people also really dislike constructive criticism being put out online because, truthfully, they're kind of just content with the way that it is. And they don't want to hear anything that would be challenging to them or would suggest that maybe there's some things that they could do better or that would make them uncomfortable. It's amazing how many people just don't want to be uncomfortable. They just want church to be comfortable. So they come in and they act like everything's fine. And there's the crystal cathedral we all go into every Sunday with our suits and ties, and we act like everything's fine and there's no problems. We shake each other's hands, and we act like we've had no problems with sin or any struggles this week or any of the past weeks with walking our Christian life. We kind of go through that scheduled, filled up routine, shake each other's hands walking out the door, and we'll do it again next week. A lot of people don't want to come to church and be challenged and saying, hey, maybe we could be doing something better. Maybe we're not doing really all that we're instructed to do. Maybe the church could be different in its projection and its growth and its reach if we corrected some of these things. There's a lot of people, unfortunately, that they just don't want to hear that. And so anytime they see a constructive criticism of the church, they position themselves as the protectors of the church. Oh, you critical people. Why are you so critical? Don't be critical. Why don't you just love what Jesus has given us in the church of Jesus Christ? And it's kind of a they want to pretend like, oh, they just love the church so much that they can't hear anything negative about it, when a lot of times they just kind of love their comfortable church and they don't want to be called to anything more. Now, that's certainly not everybody. I don't mean to characterize everybody that way, but there are some of those out there. I guess from a generational standpoint, I'm 34, I'm part of the millennial group. In our lifetime, my lifetime, some of those a little bit older, some of those a little bit younger than me, we have only ever seen the church decline. And what I mean by that is in numbers, and I think also in devotion. Church becoming less and less a part of people's lives, people wanting to give less and less of themselves to the church, prioritizing the life of the church less and less. Of course, church numbers have been declining for decades, and that's all I've ever known. And my contemporaries, the people my age, it's all we've ever known. Church is closing, not opening. The only churches that seem to ever get bigger are the churches that just kind of collect all the stray members from all the other smaller churches that are shutting down. But we've seen the church in this kind of constant decline. And there's a lot of people who just kind of want to blame the world for that. They just want to say, well, it's just the world, Satan's really good at his job and people aren't as interested in the church anymore. And we just, we can't compete with the world. And so that's why things aren't going so well. That's why our numbers are declining. That's why we're shrinking. And I think a lot of people use that excuse because they don't really want to look introspectively. I think if we look at the church collective, we, as the church, have a lot of things to work on. We could do a lot of things better. We've let some things slip over the decades, and there's a lot of constructive criticism that we need to kind of get back on track, to really take up the mission again that we've been given, and to be what Jesus has called us to be. Yeah, sure, the world has had its pull, and the world has secularized, and there are challenges there for sure. But also, there's some things that we could do better, and I think that's pretty undeniable. But how are we as the church ever going to get to work doing better in those areas if we don't hear about them in our assemblies at the local church because they're not set up to have those discussions, and people want to suppress any discussion of constructive criticism online or in any kind of public forum, how's the church going to muster up the energy? How's the church going to be informed on the things that we could be doing better and the ways that we could be more Christ-like? Well, we aren't going to be. We're not going to know about them. We're not going to discuss them. They're not going to be continuously brought to the forefront of people's minds. And if that's the case, well, what's going to happen? The church is going to continue on in the same rhythms and with the same shrinkage that we've seen in the previous decades. We can't control the world, but we can control ourselves and the way that we follow Christ and the way that we reflect him personally and collectively. And we need to be doing those things. We need to be bringing those conversations to the forefront. And there's only so many ways to do that. So I think, yes, we need to be having these conversations, and it is not only okay if the world hears them, but it's also, that might be very constructive for people in the world. One of the greatest criticisms against the church is what? That it's full of hypocrites, right? People who just pretend like they're perfect, and whether there's any validity to that, some people make that argument more validly than others. But when the world sees us being introspective first, dealing with our own problems, recognizing sin in ourselves, and working to correct those problems, I don't think that that's something that's going to scare people away. I think it's actually something that's going to draw people to the church, because they're going to realize, hey, I have problems too, but this place, they'll help me work on them. I have sins, and that's okay. I can go there, and this is a group of people I can work towards killing those sins and ridding my life of those sins together. And I know that because I've seen this church maybe online or in conversations their members have had. I've seen that they're willing to talk about their sins and to do what it takes to get rid of them and to be what God wants them to be. So I actually think that sometimes people hearing about the sins of the church or the weaknesses of the church can actually be an attractive thing to unbelievers, because no one wants to go to a church that just pretends like they're perfect all the time. And look, you can talk about how great the church is all the time and only talk about the positives, but people see through that. And if they don't see through it before they are added to the church, they'll see through it when they get to the other side, when they are actually part of the church and they realize, oh, all these people aren't actually perfect. And that can scare people away just as much. So be honest up front. And one of the ways we can be honest is having these conversations. I don't think that you do anyone any benefits when you only tell them about all the good stuff, the easy stuff, all the blessings that exist within the church and how great the church is, without telling them about the commitment that the church is, about the struggle that exists within the church to eliminate sin in our lives, and the challenges that come along with the Christian life. Absolutely, you should say, even in light of those things, you want to be a part of the church. It's the best place to be. But just saying, oh, here's 10 things I love about the church and why you should be a part of the church, and that's all you need to know before you're baptized. No, that really isn't. And we've seen a lot of people who we've gotten to accept Christ. We've gotten into the baptistry. They come out, and then it's only then that we present the difficulties. And a lot of times those people kind of disappear after a while because they realize that the Christian life is more than what they signed up for. And it may be that that's actually somewhat our fault because we don't discuss our problems and challenges publicly. And yet we expect people to take on those problems and challenges when they become members of the church without presenting the sacrifice that the Christian life is beforehand. So all that to say, I think, yes, we absolutely can talk about constructive criticisms that we have of our local church or group of churches that we're associated with. We can talk about those publicly, semi-publicly on social media. And I think really the best argument for that is the Bible does it. God does it. And he sets a precedent in the epistles for the fact that that is acceptable and also, I think, healthy to both believers and non-believers to read and to know about all those things before they agree to follow Jesus. Okay, so that's all I have for this particular discussion question and this video. I know that this is kind of niche, and so it's not probably going to be on the forefront, the front burner for everybody, but it was for me the last couple of days. So I thought I would sit down and record a quick video.